The slap landed in a room that had spent the whole evening congratulating itself on its manners. It cracked once, clean and astonishing, and the string trio near the windows lost its place for half a bar before the cephalist found the line again. Because even musicians who have played 100 fundraisers do not quite know what to do when the host strikes a guest across the face. The woman who had been struck did not stagger. She did not raise a hand to her cheek, though the mark was already rising there, the color coming up under brown skin like heat through metal. She simply stood where she was, at the edge of the reserved section of the Avonmore Gallery on University Avenue, on a soft September night in Toronto, and let the room understand what it had just watched. No one moved to help her. 200 of the city's most generous people, people who had paid $4,000 a plate to fund a children's cardiac wing, found something else to look at. What none of them knew, what the woman who had done the slapping least of all suspected, was that the person she had just humiliated in front of the entire room was the one whose signature stood between the Ashford family and ruin. The Ashfords were drowning, quietly and expensively, and the rope that had been thrown to them ran straight through the hand that was now cooling against a stranger's cheek. It would take one phone call, less than a minute of a measured voice in a marble stairwell, to let go of that rope. And by the time the orchestra reached the end of the next song, the rescue that had taken 11 months to arrange would be gone. And for the first time in 3 generations, the Ashford name would have to answer to a constable. Her name was Yvette Boncole, and she had not come to be seen. She was 46 years old, and she had grown up in a third-floor apartment in Regent Park, back before the towers came down, and the neighborhood was rebuilt into something the city liked to photograph. Her mother had cleaned offices on the night shift in the financial towers on Bay Street, the same towers Yvette's company now occupied 4 floors of, and on Saturday mornings, young Yvette had sometimes ridden the bus downtown with her to help empty bins and run a cloth along the long cold windows. She remembered the way the city looked from, up there at 5 in the morning, all that gray water and that gray sky, and the way the men in the framed photographs on the executive walls never once looked like anyone she knew. She had not resented them. She had simply, even at 9 years old, taken a kind of private measurement, the way some children do, and decided that the distance between herself and those photographs was a problem of engineering rather than of fate. She built Cardinal out of a 1-bedroom in Scarborough with a borrowed laptop and $22,000 cobbled together from a line of credit, a cashed-in RRSP, and a loan from an uncle who drove a taxi and made her promise to pay him back first, before any bank, before any partner, which she had. Cardinal moved money. It built the invisible plumbing that let small businesses across the country take a payment without surrendering a fortune to the people who owned the pipes. And then it built the data layer on top of that, and then it built the thing after that, and somewhere in the long grind of those years, it stopped being a company that needed money and became a company that decided where money went. People who had worked with her a long time would tell you she was hard to read in a meeting. Not because she was cold, but because she listened all the way to the bottom of a thing before she said anything. And when she finally spoke, she had usually already been 3 turns ahead of everyone else for 10 minutes. She had learned young that the people most worth fearing in a room were rarely the loudest ones in it, She wore a dark green dress that night, well cut and quiet, no logos, the kind of expensive that only other people who understood expense would clock. She wore her mother's small gold studs, the only jewelry her mother had ever owned that wasn't from a drugstore, and she carried a slim folio under one arm instead of a clutch. Because she was a person who brought work to a party. She had come to the gala because Cardinal's charitable arm had underwritten part of the cardiac wing, and because, separately and privately, the recapitalization that her holding company was leading was scheduled to close at 9 the following morning in a boardroom 11 floors above where she now stood. She had wanted to see the room before the room knew her. It was an old habit and a useful one. You learned things about people in the hour before they had a reason to perform for you. The Ashfords had no idea she existed in any way that mattered. To them she was, at most, a name on a term sheet, a logo, an institution. The institution had a face, and the face was here, and they walked right past it 3 times. Margot Ashford was 61, and she had run the social machinery of a certain slice of Toronto for as long as anyone in that slice could remember. She had chaired this very gala 4 times. She knew the difference between old Rosedale money and New Yorkville money, and the money that came out of Vancouver real estate, and didn't like to be asked too many questions, and she arranged her warmth accordingly, the way a woman arranges flowers, with an eye to which blooms would be seen and which could be tucked behind. She did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as someone who maintained standards in a city that had stopped bothering, and the distinction felt, to her, enormous and self-evident. She had been right about people often enough, over enough years, that the few times she'd been wrong had never gathered into anything she had to look at directly. What Margot did not let herself feel, most nights, was the floor giving way beneath the whole performance. Ashford Group had been her late father-in-law's, then her husband's, and for the better part of a decade it had been sliding. The hotels bled. A condo development out past the airport had stalled in permitting, and then in financing, and then simply stalled. The debt had a way of compounding that no amount of charm could charm. She knew the numbers the way you know a sound in your house at night, the one you've decided not to investigate. The recapitalization closing tomorrow was not, to Margot, a business event. It was the difference between her grandchildren inheriting a name that still meant something and inheriting a cautionary tale. And so she had thrown herself into the gala with the particular ferocity of a woman who needed one more night of the old life to feel real. Her husband, Charles, 63, drifted near the bar with 2 men from a Bay Street firm, talking about the morning's signing with the loose ease of a man who had been told the hard part was over. He was not a bad man. Exactly. He was a man who had inherited the certainty that the world was arranged correctly and had never once been forced to test it. Their son, Spencer, 31, listed on the firm's letterhead as a vice president of something, was on the terrace doing nothing useful with a glass of scotch and a girl who laughed too easily. It was Margot who saw the woman in the green dress move toward the reserved tables, and Margot's first reaction was purely administrative. That section was closed. She had walked the seating chart herself. The woman moving toward it did not have the look Margot's eye had been trained, over 6 decades, to wave through, and so Margot's eye snagged, and in the snag was everything. Yvette had only been crossing toward her own assigned table, which sat, as it happened, inside the cordon, because the foundation seated its major underwriters near the front. She was not pushing into anywhere. She had a card with her name on it, waiting on white linen, 40 feet away. "I'm sorry," Margot said, stepping into her path with a smile that had nothing behind it. "This area is for our patrons. The general reception is just back through there." She said it the way you'd redirect a delivery. "I'm seated here," Yvette said, mild, not yet bothered. "Bankole." She nodded toward the tables. Margot's smile did a small thing. "I don't think so," she said. "I'd remember." She glanced at the folio under Yvette's arm, at the studs, at the absence of anyone hovering at her elbow to confirm her importance, and she made the calculation she had made 10,000 times, and it came back, as it always had, in her favor. If you're with the caterer or the AV people, there's a separate entrance off the loading dock. We really can't have staff circulating in the front. A few heads had turned. That was the thing that changed it. Margot felt the audience, and the audience made her louder, surer, more herself. She put a hand on Yvette's forearm to steer her. And when Yvette did not move, did not yield to the hand the way bodies were supposed to yield to Margot's hand, something in Margot tipped from condescension into affront. She was not accustomed to a body that did not move. "This is not the room for someone like you," she said, and her voice carried now, deliberately, a verdict meant to be heard. "I don't know how you got past the door, but you're going to embarrass yourself." "Take your hand off me," Yvette said. Quiet, even. And Margot, who had not been told no by a stranger in a very long time, who felt the whole evening and the whole sliding empire and the whole unbearable nearness of the end pressing up under her sternum, raised her hand and slapped her. The room froze, the trio stumbled, and no one stepped forward. For a long second, the only people moving were the ones reaching, half aware, for their phones, not to film exactly, but the way people reach for something to hold. A server 2 tables away stopped where he stood and did not come closer. Charles at the bar hadn't seen it yet. Spencer was still on the terrace. Yvette stood in the exact place she'd been standing. She did not touch her face. She breathed once, slow, and looked at Margot, not with hatred, which would have been a kind of gift, but with a flat and total attention, the way you look at a structural crack to understand how the load is traveling through it. Then one voice broke the silence, and it did not come from any of the patrons. You can't do that. It was a young woman near the service station in a borrowed-looking gown of half size too long. One of the foundation's junior staff, Priya Sandhu, 24, who had been hired 3 weeks earlier and who would have been forgiven for keeping her head down. Her voice shook. She said it anyway. You hit her. We all saw you hit her. You can't just. She didn't have the rest of the sentence. She didn't need it. She had said the only part that mattered, the part 200 wealthy people had decided not to say. And her saying it put a small, hard crack in the room's agreement to look away. A few people had the grace to look ashamed. Margot did not. Margot had completed an action and was waiting, in the old way, for the world to confirm it, for the stranger to shrink and retreat, and for the room to resettle around her authority. When none of that came, she smoothed the front of her gown with one hand and turned a quarter turn away, as though the matter were closed. Charles arrived at her side a moment later, drawn by the change in the air. He bent his head to hear her quick, low account, and Yvette watched him listen, watched him decide, watched him land where she had known he would land, which was that his wife had probably done what needed doing, that someone had to keep order, that these things happened. He said as much, softly, but not so softly that the nearest tables couldn't catch the shape of it. Yvette heard it too. She gave no sign that she had. She reached into the folio, not her clutch, she didn't have a clutch, and took out her phone, and she made a call that lasted under 30 seconds, and the only words anyone near her would later be able to repeat were the last 3. Pull our commitment. Then she put the phone away. She walked the remaining 40 feet to her table, sat down, lifted the small printed menu card, and read it as though deciding between the salmon and the squash, while behind her, the room tried and failed to reassemble itself. 11 floors above the gallery, in a boardroom that Cardinal's deal team had been quietly working out of all evening. The call was answered by Desmond Yeboah, who had been Yvette's general counsel and right hand for 11 years, and who knew the exact difference between the voice she used when she was weighing something and the voice she used when the weighing was done. He did not ask why. He did not suggest she sleep on it. He recognized an instruction that had already been thought through to the bottom, and he began to take it apart. He made 3 calls in the next 6 minutes. The first was to the lead lawyer assembling the closing documents. The second was to the senior partner at the institutional fund that was co-investing alongside Yvette's holding company, the one whose participation only existed because hers did. The third was to the bank syndicate's coordinator. The conversations were short. They ended the same way. The closing scheduled for 9 o'clock was off the calendar. The financing commitment, the anchor that the entire $1.6 billion recapitalization hung from, was withdrawn, and without the anchor the rest came loose all at once. The co-investors board had only ever approved their tranche conditional on Yvette's. The banks had only ever extended their terms because the equity beneath them made the risk sane. Take away the floor, and the floors above it have nowhere to stand. A deal that had survived 11 months of due diligence and regulatory review, and the patient labor of more than 40 people across 5 firms. A deal that 90 minutes earlier had been the single most certain thing on every one of their calendars, was simply gone. Not paused. not renegotiated, gone. The Ashfords did not know yet. Charles was back at the bar, walking the two bankers through the next morning's schedule with the contentment of a man who believed the worst was behind him. Margot had rejoined a knot of women by the floral wall and was describing the incident to them in the satisfied register of someone who has dealt with an unpleasantness so that others wouldn't have to. Spencer was still on the terrace. For another 40 minutes, the family moved through the Gala, exactly as people move through a world they have never once doubted belongs to them. The first sign that something was wrong arrived as a phone, then two, lighting up in the pockets of the men around Charles. He watched one of the bankers read a message, then read it again, then turn his body slightly away to take a call, and Charles felt the old animal warning go off somewhere beneath his good mood, the same warning he'd been not investigating for years. The banker came back with a face that had gone wrong at the edges. "Charles," he said quietly, "have you heard from your side tonight? Anything from the lead?" "The lead's right here. We're closing in the morning. The commitment's been pulled. Just now." "The whole thing's." He stopped because there wasn't a polite way to finish it. "We're getting calls. It's unwinding." Charles laughed, the reflex of a man who could not yet make the words mean anything. "That's not. There's no reason. Everything's signed but the signing. Who pulled it? On whose authority?" The banker looked at his phone again, as if to be sure, and then he said the name. He said it, the way you say a name you've only ever seen at the bottom of a document. And then he looked across the room, and his eyes found the woman in the green dress, sitting alone at the patron's table, reading a menu card, the cooling print of a hand still faint on her cheek, and the understanding moved across his face like a shadow crossing a floor. It spread from there. It reached the second banker, then a foundation board member, then a city councilor, who had been seated 2 tables from Yvette all night and had nodded at her once. Vaguely, the way you nod at someone you assume you ought to know. Margot was summoned from the floral wall by a tightness in her husband's posture she could read from across the room. She arrived expecting to be told something manageable. What she was told instead required several full seconds to enter her, not because it was complicated, but because taking it in meant tearing out a certainty she had held since the instant she'd stepped into the green dress's path. She had been so sure. Not about a name, she'd never had the name. That was the whole horror of it. She had been sure about a category. She had looked at a woman and decided, from a place she would never have admitted to, that the woman was less than the room, that her presence was an error to be corrected, that her comfort did not require a single thought. And she had been wrong. Not in a small factual way that an apology could close, but in the entire machinery she had used to sort the world for 61 years. The first thing to reach her face was not shame. It was a draining of color, the look not of a person understanding something, but of a person who has just felt the ground confirm it isn't there. Charles moved across the gallery toward Yvette's table with the desperate, brisk purpose of a man hurrying toward a consequence he already knows he cannot reach in time. He had built something in his head on the way over, a few careful phrases, contrite enough to soften her, and elastic enough to leave a door cracked, the possibility that some sufficient acknowledgement might yet make the morning happen. He reached the edge of her table. He cleared his throat. He said her name, the full professional weight of it, as if pronouncing it correctly now might pay down the cost of not having known it an hour ago. "Miss Bancoli, I owe you an apology. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. My wife had no idea who you were," she thought. She was given the wrong impression, and she acted on it, and if she'd had the right information, none of this would have happened. I hope we can. I'm asking you to let us fix it. Yvette looked at him without expression, and she let the words finish, all of them, and settle. And then she set down the menu card. "I understand what you're trying to say," she said, and her voice was not unkind, which somehow made it worse for him. "And I believe you think it's an apology. But listen to what you actually said. Your wife had no idea who I was. That's your apology. The problem, in your telling, is that she happened to be wrong about me. That if I'd turned out to be a caterer, this would have been fine. That's not. Your wife didn't strike me because she made a mistake about my resume, Yvette went on, and now the whole nearest section of the room was listening, the way a room listens when it has nowhere left to hide. She struck me because she decided, before she'd heard a word out of my mouth, that I was a person she was allowed to put her hands on. She was completely confident about who she was permitted to humiliate. The only thing she got wrong tonight was the arithmetic. And you've come over here to apologize for the arithmetic. Charles stood there with his rehearsed phrases dissolving in his mouth. You're not sorry she did it, Yvette said. You're sorry it was expensive. She let that sit. Then she said, the deal isn't coming back. I want to be clear about that, because I can see you doing the math. Looking for the version where if you say the right thing in the next 2 minutes the morning happens after all. It doesn't. I didn't pull it to punish your family. I pulled it because tonight you showed me, all of you, exactly how the people inside your company treat someone they've decided doesn't count. And I am not going to put $1 of my life's work into the hands of people like that and trust them to behave when no one important is watching. That's not revenge. That's diligence. You just handed me the most useful piece of information I've gotten in 11 months, and you did it for free. He didn't argue. There was nothing in him to argue with. She wasn't finished, and this was the part the room would remember longest. And the slap, she said, is a separate thing. That one isn't a business decision, and it isn't mine to forgive in a ballroom. There were 200 witnesses, and there are 4 cameras over that bar. Your wife committed an assault in front of all of them. So no, we're not going to settle this with a handshake and an understanding between gentlemen. I've already asked someone to call the police. They're on their way. They were. A pair of constables arrived through the front doors within 15 minutes, unhurried, taking in the chandeliers and the orchestra and the strange held quality of the air with the practiced neutrality of people who have walked into a great many rooms after the worst of it. Priya Sandhu, the young woman in the borrowed gown, gave her account first and clearest, her hands still trembling, her chin level. The bartender pointed up at the cameras without being asked. Other guests, freed now that the verdict had reversed, suddenly remembered with great precision what they had seen. Margot Ashford was not handcuffed in the gallery. The constables had no appetite for that particular spectacle. But she was spoken to quietly near the coat check, in front of enough people that the quiet did her no good at all. And she was told she would be charged, and she was asked to come to the station, and she went out the front doors of the building she had ruled for 30 years between 2 officers, past the photographers who were always parked outside a gala like this, hoping for nothing more than a nice frock, and who could not believe their luck. By morning the footage was on 3 networks. By noon a national anchor was saying the family's name in a voice trained to stay even. The clip of the slap and the clip of a young foundation worker named Priya Sandhu saying, "You hit her. We all saw you," ran beside each other on every feed in the country. Yvette saw none of it live. She had left before the constables finished. She gathered her folio, stood, and walked out through the corridor, and into the elevator, and out into the September night, where the air off the lake had finally turned cool, and University Avenue ran north under its long row of lit towers, one of which her mother had once cleaned at 4 in the morning while a girl helped her empty the bins. She felt no triumph. That surprised people when she said it later, the few times she said it at all. But it was true. She took no pleasure in the Ashfords' collapse, because reducing them had never been the point, and a woman who has spent her life being underestimated learns early that the appetite for someone else's ruin is a poverty all its own. The point had only ever been to protect the thing she had built, 20 years of it, from people who genuinely could not tell the difference between having power and having character, who thought money was the same as judgment, who believed that the confidence required to strike a stranger in a crowded room was a kind of strength when it was, in fact, its exact opposite, a smallness so total it had to keep proving itself on people it had decided couldn't fight back. She had not needed to bring the Ashfords down. She had only needed to take her hand off the rope and let the weight they had been carrying do what weight does. She thought about the slap on the walk to her car, the 1 second of it, the heat and the sound and the public nature of the thing, the specific texture of being harmed in plain sight in a room full of people who chose, in the moment, their own comfort over yours. She knew that texture. She had known it in smaller forms her whole life: the cab that didn't stop, the assistant who asked her to wait for the actual miss. Bankily, the meeting where she was handed a coat. She had learned a long time ago that the cleanest answer to being told you don't belong in a room is not to argue. And not even, really, to win, but simply to keep building until the room turns out to have been yours the whole time. She had built a company worth $28 billion out of a borrowed laptop and a taxi driver's loan, and the woman who'd been slapped tonight in front of 200 witnesses was that same woman, which meant she already knew everything she needed to know about how things begin and what they're capable of becoming, and, in the end, who actually gets to decide. The charges held. The recapitalization never came back, and Ashford Group entered the slow public unwinding that everyone close to it had seen coming for years. A name that would be taught, eventually, in business schools as a small, clean illustration of how much contempt can cost when it finally meets the bill. Yvette would not be the one telling that story. She didn't need to. The facts had their own momentum, and she had understood for a very long time that the most powerful thing you can do in a world built to underestimate you is not to fight the underestimation, but to outlast it, to make something so plainly, undeniably real that even the people most desperate to wave you toward the loading dock are left without the words. She drove home along the lake with the windows down. There was a meeting at 8 the next morning she was actually looking forward to. A small company out east that did something clever with cold storage logistics, founders who reminded her a little of herself at 30. There were things to build. There were always things to build. And the building had been the answer, all along, to every question earned the right to stand in the room. About whether she had earned the right to stand in the room. She had no intention of stopping. The lake went by dark and wide on her right. The same water she'd looked down on at 5 in the morning as a girl. And the city held its lights up against it, and somewhere behind her, a Gala was still emptying out into a night that had rearranged itself. Very quietly and all at once, around a woman who had simply refused to move when a stranger told her to.